So I've got an interview here with Dr. John Warner from the Political Science Department at K-State. He's the author of Rousseau and the Problem of Human Relations. And today I want to talk to him specifically about Charles Taylor's The Malaise of Modernity and the themes of authenticity and sincerity that Taylor comments on partly through a discussion of Rousseau. But needless to say, we've got an expert on Rousseau here. So this is so great because I did a series on Charles Taylor's The Malaise of Modernity just a little while ago, and he mentions Rousseau as kind of a point in the development of European thought when authenticity still meant something different than what it means today. Yeah. And before we get into that, I just thought maybe the readers would like to hear a little bit of your writing and kind of set the stage in a way for what we're going to talk about. This is from a chapter in a book that's entitled Leadership and the Unmasking of Authenticity that came out around 2018. It's The Lie in the Soul, Authenticity, Hypocrisy, and Self-Deception in Rousseau. And this is just the first paragraph. Hopefully people will kind of, you can feel yourself in this paragraph. A distinctive and controversial feature of contemporary democratic life is its preoccupation with sincerity. In 1970, Lionel Trilling noted our intense aversion to hypocrisy and deep admiration for those who stay true to themselves. And in the following years, several conservative critics argued that the United States had developed a navel-gazing culture of narcissism that mistook self-involvement for self-realization and celebrated ostentation over achievement. The more recent emergence of social media has only further encouraged us to display and disclose our true selves in ways that would have been unimaginable even a generation ago. And while it is certainly true that platforms like Facebook and Instagram make courageous acts of self-definition possible, it must also be admitted that they encourage users to foist all aspects of their lives, no matter how banal, private, or shameful, on an unsuspecting and largely uninterested group of friends. In fact, increasing numbers of social scientists and psychologists have become concerned that social media sites that indulge our appetite for self-disclosure have contributed to an epidemic of narcissism and ironically have constructed a social reality so superficial that it denies users the opportunity to develop anything like an authentic self. I just thought that kind of captured our moment and kind of gathered in some of the stuff that I've been thinking about Taylor, also Christopher Lasch in his book, The Culture of Narcissism. And you know so much about Rousseau, so I just wanted to maybe start with, your take of what Charles Taylor is grappling with, this sort of superficial kind of notion of authenticity that's on display in the types of things that you're writing about there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing, I don't know Taylor certainly as well as you do. I've encountered him some through Rousseau and some through the kind of multiculturalism section, the communitarian section I teach in the contemporary political philosophy class. But I might just kind of talk about this more naively, just as a person who's on these platforms, who participates in them, although I don't share quite as compulsively maybe as some people. But on some level, I think Taylor is just describing a reality that we all recognize in his work, and all you have to do is go on Facebook and go on Instagram, and pictures of people's dinners, long descriptions of people's workout routines, what they had for breakfast, why they had that and not something else. Really personal disclosures that are sort of bellowed out, into the world. It's really odd, right? And these sorts of a lot of times these kinds of posts are like marked with a sort of defiance, right? That I'm going to be me, no matter come hell or high water, I'm going to be me. And then it just sort of washes over you, the consumer of this stuff, and you're just kind of looking for a context to situate the words, to situate the action, and you don't have any of that. And then you feel like even if you did, it would kind of raise more questions, right? And so, you know, I don't want to be too critical of those platforms or any particular platforms. I use social media, you know, myself. I'm not like immune to this. But it's odd and it's interesting how many opportunities we've created for ourselves to talk about ourselves, right? It's certainly something that it, you know, invites all kinds of questions about why we're doing it and why are we doing it and the way in which we're doing it. You know, I think Rousseau provides a lot of resources for helping us formulate interesting versions of those kinds of broad questions, as well as giving us some resources for actually, like, you know, kind of answering those questions, if only in a provisional way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, can he help with understanding where this comes from? Because I think that the reason why all this is going on in the social media is simply because there's a market for it. So the product, so to speak, is we're producing it, right, through our posts and so on. And if we didn't want to do that, if that isn't what like gave us a charge, social media wouldn't exist. So it's glomming onto and profiting off of this like impulse, and maybe it's amplifying it too, but the impulse is already there. Can Rousseau help with understanding where that impulse comes from?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot, and in a couple of different ways. One way, and I think here's where maybe Rousseau and Taylor, I detect a kind of a difference between them. And that's that, I mean, Rousseau really emphasizes the distinctness of the individuated I. Even in the state of nature, I want to be careful, because there's no self properly speaking, because there's no consciousness, there's no memory, there's no foresight. There's a sentiment of a present existence. There's not a sort of a full-fledged sentiment of existence. But even the human beings in the state of nature seem to understand that they're individuated from other persons and other objects, right? I mean, and again, I use the term understand loosely because it's not a cognitive understanding. It's just sort of a very, very functional, in the same way that like my dog understands that, you know, her body is different from my other dog's body, and so on. So it's really like precognitive, prediscursive form of understanding. And so for one thing, I think Rousseau really emphasizes the importance of the I in the state of nature, the distinctness of the self, and how each person is sort of marked out in a certain way or individuated from the rest of creation. And this, of course, the I undergoes a transformation in society, as you know, anybody who's read Taylor or anybody who's read Rousseau knows, is that the social self and the quote unquote natural self are very different things, right? Most of the things that we associate with, you know, ourselves are in fact, they're kind of artifacts of society. So when I talk about my identity, myself, my interests, my thing, well, I'm choosing these things in some sense, but these are social products, you know, in another sense. And so one of the things that Rousseau really emphasizes here, one of the things that we pick up in society is a desire to stand out. A desire to display ourselves, you know, to be better than others, to rank ourselves relative to others. This is something we acquire. It's not something that's natural for Rousseau. but it's not natural, but it in some way derives from something that is natural, which is a special and ineliminable concern with yourself as yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's natural, and that's not going away. There is this sort of immovable core to the human being that's, we're actuated by a desire to preserve ourselves. And then this desire for preservation gets refracted and altered and changed in a whole variety of ways once we enter into society. But the thing that doesn't go away is that we always prioritize our interests and our desires, whatever the substance of those things happen to be. We always come first, others always come second, or always, I shouldn't say always, but usually or characteristically they do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Rousseau gives us a lot of ammunition, I guess, for kind of understanding where does this market come from, right? Why do we have this desire in the first place? In a way, you could trace it back to something fundamental in human nature, but if you just went back to that, you really wouldn't have a lot of success understanding the complexity of the matter. You'd really have to also look at the various ways in which self-love is transformed, altered, and corrupted in society. And that's kind of where this desire for recognition, for disclosure, for relative position, all of that is a consequence of our own kind of anxious awareness of ourselves as social beings.
Okay. So for Rousseau, society is more or less an accident, right? It's not something that had to happen.
Yeah.
It did happen, and therefore put us into this situation where the original sort of self-awareness, would that be a good way of putting it, becomes like it sort of gets corrupted by the influences of others, and it becomes competitiveness, and it's sort of downhill.
There is a connection. There's a reason why. There's a reason rooted in nature for Rousseau why we care about ourselves more than others, right? Now, yeah, but then like why we crave, high social position, why we want others to look at us and not somebody else, why we want more money than our neighbors, why we want a thicker, more lush lawn, why we want a nicer car. You can't go back to nature and kind of explain these things any more than you could, like, people go back to like, they appeal to natural law to, complain about a like 1% adjustment in the marginal tax rate, right? All of a sudden we violated natural law or something. And it's like, no, natural law doesn't give us that kind of specific guidance. Same kind of thing I think applies here about Rousseau and the state of nature is that there's this kind of broad, really strong imperative to preserve yourself. But yeah, it doesn't lead us to worry about other people or our position relative to other people. All that kind of comes later.
Right. And it's presented as not being necessary, not as necessary. Yeah. So, I mean, Taylor's got this story of like in modernity, the sort of disembedding of people, with the rise of what I would call with the rise of liberalism in particular, you get this notion of the kind of the atomized self, and you get, this strong idea of individual independence and rights. And this leaves the individual adrift. He kind of follows Tocqueville on this, kind of leaves the individual adrift to more or less, with this ideal of authenticity, to find their authenticity on their own without reference to, institutions that they might previously have drawn from, to find the meaning of their life, and through some sort of process in which it comes directly out of them, rather than the meaning of my life is what the church says it is, or what, the village says it is, or, whatever. And this, he says, is where the mistake begins to occur. The idea that it has to come entirely from yourself, and that uniqueness is the thing, to strive. Every individual a snowflake, you might say, I mean, he implies in, I think it's chapter 3, he doesn't actually make a real strong argument, but there's an implication there that Rousseau, in his thought, embodies a way of viewing authenticity that is better than that. That it provides a way of not rejecting it entirely. To reject it entirely would be to go back to some sort of like neo-orthodoxy, that like, we're going to be whatever, we're going to adhere to the Catholic Church's teachings 100%. Or we're going to be good Russians, or, whatever, whatever you want to identify with. And certainly a lot of people in our society are kind of are sort of like thinking about those routes. But Taylor basically says that, no, and not just because, he doesn't make the usual argument of we just can't go backwards, but rather he says there's something good about this modern ideal of authenticity. There's something good about it that we need to recover. And it's very classic Taylor to try to go back and retell the story and recover the original meaning. And he brings Rousseau in at that point. And so I wonder if there is, in like what you've described as far as the original, sense of distinctness or sense of self that a person has before they enter into the mistakes along the way, that could be a source. Maybe this is what Taylor is referring to, a source of at least being able to build a true understanding of authenticity. But at the same time, I hear what you're saying. That original person is an individual. So, it's in Rousseau's version, that person is out there roaming around on their own and already has this sense of self that's pretty distinct. So, I don't know, I guess I'm asking, is Taylor wrong in using Rousseau here the way he does?
I mean, again, I wouldn't want to, I'd want to be careful about, I wouldn't want to read too much into the self that exists in the state of nature, because again, it is, this is just, the self is like a physiological conduit for the forces of nature, right? So the kind of harmonious forces of nature flow in and through this physiologically individuated body. And that's about all there is. That's about all the individual self is it's just this sort of like site of, physiological and like really, really limited psychological continuity, right? It's just like a locus for desire. And so I wouldn't want to like press this argument about selfhood and the state of nature. I wouldn't want to like press this very, very far at all. Now, so, but so to Taylor, if Taylor thinks that, well, I'll put it this way. Let me see if I understand your characterization of Taylor properly. In other words, that sort of Rousseau is one of, not the only, but one of the sources of this kind of, let's call it impoverished ideal of authenticity that we see on Instagram. You know, somebody gets a tattoo of a butterfly and they're like, I'm reborn, I gotta be me, or whatever.
I think what he's saying is Rousseau is putting forth a better authenticity than that, but his ideas and ideas like his get perverted later on down the road.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And that, so it's, there are questions of maybe Rousseau's original meaning versus Rousseau's legacy that need to be disentangled and so forth. I certainly think that that's right. And, I think that, Rousseau doesn't really, I'm a little bit, for precisely that reason, because I'm interested in, being careful about separating what Rousseau says from Rousseau's legacy, as difficult as that is. I think it's important to try to continue to do. And so a lot of times I'm cautious about reading ideals like authenticity into Rousseau, because he doesn't really use that language. I think he uses the term itself maybe 2 or 3 times, and he never means it in the sense in which we mean it, right? If we're looking for an ideal of authenticity in Rousseau, we would have to start by, at least his language is a little bit more traditional. It's, probity, integrity, honesty, and certainly sincerity. Sincerity is certainly a virtue that I think is adjacent to authenticity, where Rousseau has maybe enacted a kind of a revolution or something like this. But I think the idea that there is in Rousseau how to put it? I mean, could we reconstruct from Rousseau a more meaningful, richer conception of authenticity, and whether he calls it that or not or whatever? Could we do that? Yeah, I think we could. And I think Rousseau, it's interesting because he's on both sides of this issue, and he's characterized it. It sounds like I'm actually closer to Taylor than I would be to somebody like Arthur Melzer, who really wants to go back and, he says that Rousseau has provided a proper religion of the self. It's a religion of sincerity, and that's really that ideal kind of exists at the deepest stratum of Rousseau's thought. I'm maybe agnostic about that particular claim, but I'm not agnostic about some of the things that people say on Rousseau's behalf about I'll call it the availability of the self, right? So this idea that, once we've identified that society is a problem, once we've identified that social institutions kind of alienate us from our original selves, and once we recognize this and kind of learn how to, you go out in the woods, you take a few walks, you get away from the destructive influences of society, you kind of, step back and disentangle yourself. Well, then you can rediscover, you can reattain this kind of connection to your natural self. You can reestablish moral contact with who you really are, right? And that it's a relatively straightforward kind of a process. All right. So this is an argument that gets attributed to Rousseau. Yeah. So I mean, a lot of what I'm doing now, and I think a lot of what the paper you read, the passage from, was a kind of initial foray into a number of aspects of Rousseau's work that really problematize this idea that the self is kind of just epistemically available, right? It's there as long as you approach the question of who you are with the right motivations, right? So if you're sincere, if you really want to know who you are, get knowledge of yourself, if you're willing to kind of step outside of society, then this, this natural self will kind of reemerge of its own accord, that it will do so relatively unproblematically, right? That I don't have any special epistemic burdens, that I, there are no real dangers that I need to be aware of, that basically understanding and knowing myself is not easy, but simple, right?
And that would look like us deciding to go on a total social media fast for 6 months, maybe go to a cabin in the woods somewhere, and not even 6 months, like maybe 1 month,
There you go. So
we tap back into who I really am.
You could step outside of the chaos of social institutions, get out of the rat race, pick your metaphor, right? And that the self will like sort of just, again, like reemerge on its own once you quiet the noise. Then what will happen is that you'll rediscover who you really are, whatever that means, right? The reason I have a problem with this, well, there are a lot of reasons, but I'll try to be concise. Is that it's not that Rousseau doesn't think this is possible. I just think that he thinks it's a lot harder than he sometimes makes it sound. I think we see again and again of his like so-called, exemplars. These are figures who are fit for imitation. We see them, we see any number of like sort of false dawns in their own quests to understand and to know themselves. They think they do, and then it turns out they don't. They think they do, but it turns out they were deceiving themselves all along. They think they have kind of disentangled themselves from the chaos of society. They think they've separated themselves from the poisonous influence of amour propre and vanity and the desire to be recognized and seen, but it turns out, right? So they think all this is true, and then it turns out not to be, right? And that, so you see these kind of like, quite hilarious failures of self-knowledge, recur again and again and again and again. And this happens to people who are sincere. They're trying, they're doing their best, and they aren't stupid. They aren't uneducated. They aren't insincere, but it's just hard. It's hard to be a decent person in Rousseau's moral universe. It's hard to disentangle yourself from these acquired passions. You don't just go to a cabin in the woods for a little while. It's really epistemically tough.
I'm thinking of Emile here, and how Emile goes, and Sophie, they go through this whole education designed to make them the ideal person who's truly got that core and isn't being swayed by, I guess, society. And as soon as something happens, the loss of a child, right? Mm-hmm. And they move to, was it Paris? They decide they can't live in the country anymore. They move to Paris, and she has an affair, and the whole thing comes crashing down. Their marriage ends, and he goes wandering off to, I guess the message is he's got the tools built up, mental and physical, to be able to like make it on his own. But it's not a happy story. And that's a case of Rousseau actually, in his imagination, creating this ideal couple, right? If I've got the reading of that right, based on the best principles, and he's still showing that one hardship kind of brings it down.
Yeah. So yeah, a couple things on Emile and Sophie's example in particular. And the first thing is exactly what you said. I just want to underscore it, is the fragility the enterprise, just how liable things are to fall back into chaos. So even if you've established, imagine, we'll just go back to the situation of establishing contact with your true self, just how fragile, just how spotty, just how like attenuated that contact is. That it's not something that once it's there, it's there. It may kind of fade in and out, and so yeah, I take your point about the sort of fragility of the enterprise, and really all of Rousseau's enterprises are touched by this kind of fragility, I think. There's a second thing though that occurs to me. It's only recently occurred to me that like Emile is not an authentic self. I mean, there's nothing about Emile that is Emile's. Everything about Emile is the tutor's. I think this sort of occurred to me, like I was talking to my advisor recently, and he sort of like makes the point that like Emile is not interesting. And it's true. I mean, would you want to hang out with Emile? I wouldn't.
No, you're right.
He's just this kind of this cipher, he's just like
it's almost an experiment.
Yeah, he's just like a marionette for the tutor. The interesting character in Emile is the tutor.
Yeah.
It's not Emile. And I think part of the reason that maybe things go wrong is and this is signaled, at the end of the novel a little bit, is that Emile can't do without his tutor. He says, "Stay with us, guide me so that I can imitate you." He's not ready. Mm-hmm. He's not ready to be himself. He's not ready to be anybody. And so and then things go wrong as they do. And so there's a kind of, I guess there's an ambiguity there about something like authenticity or being your true self. Maybe on the one hand, you could say, well, if he were more himself, he might be more flawed, but he might be more resilient in the face of the challenges that he's going to have to deal with. So you might sort of draw that lesson. It's not an obvious lesson to draw, but maybe maybe Emile's problem is that he isn't authentic.
Yeah, I mean, that even maybe Rousseau's intention is to show that, I don't know, like maybe you can't make a person, there is no ideal education that will draw this out. I don't know, but yeah, it is a tragic message in the end. It's not a hopeful message that it's easy to achieve this ideal state.
I think there's a lot of, that kind of motif in Rousseau is ever present. And I think it's really tempting to jump at the first synthesis or to jump at the first resolution to a problem. And I mean, the first time I read Emile in particular, I'm literally in tears. I was so happy. For Emile and Sophie. And I thought, this is great. This is all what a beautiful ending to a lovely story. Mm-hmm. And he invites that kind of reading. And I think you have to go back and you start to see, God, there are some problems here. Right. And I think that the question of like the availability of the self is maybe there's an analogy here, is that Rousseau does say, he says it in the moral letters, the vicar says it in the profession of faith. Rousseau himself says it, so to speak, in his own voice, albeit in a more qualified way, but he does it in places just kind of say that the self is there to be understood. You have to recognize the way that your passions distort and disfigure your thinking. You have to get away from society. You have to focus on what's important. And you have to find your conscience, right? You've got to get back in touch with your conscience.
Yeah, the conscience, right? Now, one of the things that Taylor and many other people just tons of people like complain about is that it doesn't seem as though the modern person has like a good, solid, well-grounded conscience, because it has become, that's, like I'm being me, this is kind of a gloss, but I'm being me, and whatever I feel at the moment is equally valid to, whatever you feel at the moment.
Yeah.
And don't tell me what I should think and feel. So, the notion that there might be more there, that there is a conscience. If Rousseau thinks that there is such a thing as sort of a natural conscience, this may be part of what attracted Taylor to him, and that might make him a little different, because I think probably Taylor is somewhat incorrect about Rousseau after hearing you, but he goes from Rousseau to talking about the romantics, like Herder, somebody he mentions, and he says at that point, we take this turn where it just becomes about your emotional state. Like it turns into emotivism, and there's nothing there. There's no there. So like when you peel all that away, was Rousseau saying that there is a moral conscience of sorts in the person to discover?
Yeah. So, this is controversial. My own view is that there isn't a conscience. I don't think Rousseau believes in the idea of a conscience, at least a conscience understood as a natural sense of moral right and wrong. It's very strange to me how he could believe in. I don't understand how he could believe in that, given his depiction of human beings in the state of nature who are profoundly amoral. He says explicitly and reemphasizes so many times in so many works that there is no good and evil in the state of nature. There's just preservation and not preservation. There is, right? Like none of these feelings are morally or ethically valenced, right? You just feel an impulse and that drives you to act. And so it's
sort of animalistic.
Yeah.
But what about the sense of pity?
Well, pity is I think that pity is pity, but it's not conscience, right? So pity is the foundation for I'm trying to remember the phrase that Rousseau uses in the second discourse, that pity is the basis for beneficence and all the virtues and even friendship. So he identifies pity as the psychological basis for the virtues. So in other words, like the virtues, so to speak, grow out of pity. They're in some way refracted or attenuated expressions of pity. But pity itself in its original native state isn't a moral, it isn't a normative phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
All it is a revulsion to suffering, right? Mm-hmm. So in a certain way, there are different ways of cashing out what the experience of pity would be like. But one way to think about it would just be, it's just like, it's this visceral experience of revulsion, right? So you see somebody suffering, yes, especially somebody like you, and you just go, ugh, mm-hmm. And so the discussion of pity in the second discourse is like, it's really interesting. And I don't know. I talk about that in the book some, but I think what's important is that like all Rousseau needs pity to do is to restrain people from harming people for no reason, right? And this is actually usually how he characterizes the function of pity, at least in The State of Nature. All the examples are negative. So pity prevents us from, taking food away from a sick old man or a small child if we think we can get our meal elsewhere. We don't want to witness suffering. We don't want to be the cause of suffering. We don't want to be anywhere around suffering, right? It's not because we're moral creatures. It's just because we think it's gross.
Okay. Yeah,
I mean, that's a very sort of the different way to read it. I'm not like asserting this as a fact. I'm asserting it as my view.
So you're saying that's not a strong enough thing to be standard bearing, basically. It's just a sort of instinctual attribute of a person in that state. I
don't think it does as much as any kind of standard use of like when I use the word conscience and the ideas that evokes in your head about the way in which a conscience would like guide and regulate my conduct versus the way that instinctual native pity would guide and regulate my conduct. I think pity is maybe far less influential, and it's not discursive. It's not rational, right? We think about conscience as belonging to a rational creature who can articulate standards of right and wrong, and that's a capacity that Rousseau explicitly and repeatedly denies to human beings in the state of nature. And so I have real questions about the status of conscience as an innate moral faculty for Rousseau. Even when he talks about moral conscience in his own voice, the examples he uses are oddly qualified. So some of the language he uses, so there's an example early in Emile when he talks about a child, like an infant who was crying, and then it got slapped, right? And then he looked at the child and he drew the conclusion, so the child stops crying and he draws the conclusion, well, this is a servile, creature, nothing good will ever be. But then he says, I was wrong, because then he says that like, oh, well, the child explodes into rage, right? And so the child's indignant at having been slapped. He views it as an injustice. And then Rousseau says, I'll have to be careful about his language. I'll get it a little wrong, hopefully not too wrong. He says, if I had ever doubted that notions of right and wrong were innate to the heart of man, this example sufficed to show me, right? Well, you go, well, wait a minute. Well, show me what?
Yeah.
Right? Does that show that the child had an internal standard of right and wrong? Or does it show that the child learned to be indignant when it was treated unfairly? Right? Like, what does it actually show? And it's not clear. And so even when Rousseau uses the language of conscience, the actual examples sort of much more ambiguous than they initially seem.
So, like, is Rousseau more, I hope I'm going to make myself clear here, is he more negative than he is positive then, in the sense that he's very good at kind of showing you what's gone wrong and how various things we've done have made us miserable, than he is at really providing any sort of meaningful way out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my thinking has maybe evolved just a little bit on this question. I think if you'd asked me this 5 years ago, I probably would have said, I probably would have answered unqualifiedly, yes, he's more of a diagnostician than he is, a pharmacist. He can tell you what's wrong, but his very diagnosis of the problem suggests that there isn't a solution, there isn't a cure. There are sort of ameliorative strategies that might be more or less effective. I think I would have sort of said that in a pretty full-throated way. 5 years ago, I still think that that's basically right. I do think, though, that he might be more, I think there may be more kind of constructive potential in Rousseau than I would have wanted to say, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. The question is what kind of constructive potential? How can he help us out? And I think it's precisely in some of these I think it's precisely in some of these examples of self-deception. He can teach us about what we're doing when we're doing what these characters are doing. So instead of getting sucked into the desire to identify with some of these characters who you're clearly meant to identify with, Sampre in Julie, or Julie in Julie, or Bomson, some of these other sort of characters. I'll talk about Julie for just a second. These are sympathetic characters. They're trying to be good people. So they aren't bourgeois hypocrites. They aren't, the man of the world, this, deceitful, duplicitous, nasty, self-interested egoist who smiles in your face and stabs you behind your back. They're not like that. They're doing their best to live decent lives and to treat each other with respect and to know themselves and to understand what their duties are. They're trying hard, and in that sense, they're exemplars. But they get it wrong. They get it wrong all the time, and they make terrible, hilarious mistakes about what they're supposed to do. They self-deceive. They're engaged in magical, motivated thinking. They do all kinds of wild things and say all kinds of crazy things. And I think if we can kind of step back and find ourselves in the mistakes that these characters are making, then we can actually make some progress, albeit this is just the progress of individuals. I'm not talking about institutional reform or anything like this. I'm still not, I'm not convinced Rousseau really had any optimism or real ambitions about reforming political institutions in any kind of concrete way. I think he's interested in the kind of individual salvation of readers, right? So speaking directly to each reader and giving him or her the resources that they need to get themselves out of the mess that they find themselves in. And part of that process is, of course, recognizing that you are in a mess.
Interesting. Yeah.
I just meant to mention the characters in this book as exemplars of at least exemplars of a certain kind. They're exemplars that if we wanted to be better people, we could sort of find ourselves in them, right? They're imperfect enough for us to identify with, and their struggles are recognizable. The struggles of people who love each other but can't be together, friends who are separated and spread all over the world. They're trying to fix all the problems that they made for themselves in the past. And so they're always trying to, figure out what went wrong and how to fix it, but they're always doing that with imperfect information and imperfect faculties of judgment. And like, I don't know that. Yeah, I recognize that. That makes sense, right? That makes sense to me. In a very practical way. I want to do better. I want to be a decent person. I don't think of myself as a horrible bourgeois hypocrite. But
I'm not going to call you one either.
Yeah, good. I'm glad. But like how can I keep myself from making the mistakes that I would otherwise make? And I think he can really help us with some of that. So he can provide us a lot of resources, I think, for introspection. And that's certainly true, like in the novels, and of course the autobiographical stuff as well, where Rousseau is like struggling with exactly these same problems. And his last work, The Reveries, in the Third Walk, well, he says this a number of times, but in the Third Walk, I think it's the Third Walk, he basically says, look, knowing yourself is a lot harder than I thought it was. It's a lot harder than I thought it was in the Confessions. And let me talk about why that is. And he goes on to talk about kind of subconscious self-deception, right? And how you do things, your self-love and your desire to be to seen, and I would say like your self-preference controls you in ways that you're not even aware of, right? And this can lead you to do things without realizing why. And this, getting access to our own motivations and our own true reasons for doing the things that we do, this is really hard, and I think we have to recognize it's really hard. But once we recognize it's really hard, that comes at a cost. That means giving up on this epistemically available self, right? We kind of have to go in a little bit more of like a Pascalian direction, or kind of like locate Rousseau a little bit closer to kind of the French moralists and a little further away from the idiots on Instagram, right? Sorry, go on.
I'm hoping so. I didn't want to cut you off, so if you have another point to make before.
Well, the only thing I would say, I mentioned Pascal, and I don't think, I wouldn't say, again, I wouldn't want to sort of press this argument too hard. I think there is a difference between, say, Pascal and Rousseau when it comes to the knowability of the self. For Pascal, it's all just shadows and uncertainty. And you really can't ever know yourself. Mm-hmm. I think for Rousseau, this emerges as a genuine possibility. There is a self to know, okay, but it's not going to emerge of its own accord. It's not just available, ready to be sort of like plucked off the tree and admired. It's hard to access, and the access we get is fleeting and transitory, and it's kind of in and out, right? The connection is buffering, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I as I'm hearing you say these things, I'm thinking, why do I really need to find myself in the first place? Like I've kind of wondered about this. It's a Western obsession in a way, I think, right? And why is it so disturbing, the thought that we might not have a fixed core that doesn't change, which I think is in the back of a lot of people's minds, that there's something there that doesn't change, that's in me, that makes me me. Mm-hmm. to me, it's not terribly disturbing to think that there might not be that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know why, but it just doesn't bother me all that much. I think it would be difficult to find that core in myself that's somehow completely unique. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure I would want to spend a lot of time trying to do so. And I do feel like I'm a fairly individual
Yeah.
despite that. So I think maybe part of our problem seems to be that there is almost an obsession with this, right? And it's ramped up in our culture because so there's so many ways to make money off of it.
Right.
I mean, does it have to be this big of a quest? Do we have to, because I think that the Instagram thing or whatever comes from, I can find myself through other people's recognition, and I can define myself and then have that reflected back on me. But I wonder if maybe it might not be good for our society to ask the question, why are we so obsessed with this to begin with? And is it really necessary? Is one more fulfilled if one somehow finds this magic, core that makes me me?
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a massive sort of question. I guess a couple of things occur to me that at least have some tangential relation to Rousseau. But I guess, like, when I think about, why is it important for me to know myself? I mean, the person I think about is actually not Rousseau, it's Socrates. And the idea that, well, it's important for me to know myself, because what it means to know myself is to, like, know human nature. And so what enables me to know myself also enables me to know others. And what enables me to know others also helps me to know myself. So it's a question of it's less a question of what makes me me and not somebody else. It's more a question of, well, what are the things about me that I share with others? And then if I can kind of reason from that basis, I can have knowledge of like the human animal, in some kind of way. But your point, your point is that, what it means to know yourself, the sense of that has really changed, right? We don't think about self-knowledge in that Socratic way. We think about it in this, Taylor might say a Rousseauian way, which is what makes me me, what makes me different, what marks me out from others, what makes me, special or worthy of extra attention and regard and recognition.
What makes me extra?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that our economy creates this. I think, this is something Taylor doesn't do much of as any sort of economic analysis. That he leaves that aside. But really, I mean, it's just so profitable for people to believe that they are these unique flowers that will grow pretty if they're planted in the unique best spot for them. And all you have to do is have all the accoutrements, right? So I'm kind of a little bit like hard line on that this is an invention that, yes, maybe Rousseau and people like Rousseau might have some responsibility for, but it's a little bit more modern than that, really.
You have to recognize, right, there are other forces at play. And sometimes when I read like Melzer in particular, it kind of sounds like, there's this direct line from Rousseau to Instagram or something, and it's all Rousseau, right? And it's none of this other stuff that people actually have direct contact have any influence on their behavior, what they value. And obviously
a little bit too much credit, and our material circumstances a little bit too little credit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's right. Obviously it's when you look at the sort of like commodification of selfhood, right? And weird, like momfluencers and well, just influencers on Instagram or whatever. Yeah. It's just like, use this thing because I use it and I'm cool. And sort of it's like the person is the brand, and there's no distinction between the two. So when you see like selfhood and identity like successfully commodified in this way, of course, I take that point. And I think there's the question of why, why we can successfully commodify our identities, or some of us can and some of us can't. But the question of why, that's also complicated. So maybe you could go back to some sort of core, self-preference and say, well, of course, everybody's partial to themselves and so on. But yeah, there are certainly economic and historical and cultural factors that play into this. And yeah, we don't want to like lose sight of that and just point at, Rousseau, or point at Mill or something, because it's just that that's unserious.
It's giving them too much credit in a way, or it's just saying that everything that's happened is the result of singular ideas, and that's a nice story that political theory likes to tell sometimes.
That's right.
It's an influence, but sometimes those ideas come after other changes that take place and not before.
Yeah.
I did want to kind of come back to the concept of sincerity. You said it was adjacent to authenticity, and actually that Rousseau uses that a lot more. And I know that you've written a lot about that. So I wonder if you want to kind of give us your take on Rousseau on sincerity.
Sure.
And also self-deception. I just found what you said in that article really interesting. And I wonder if you could kind of give our viewers a little feel for what you said there.
Well, yeah. So I think that here again, that my work on this started with the suspicion that, so there's an appearance in Rousseau of a kind of a clear opposition between sincerity on one hand and, self-deception on the other. That over here in the world of sincerity, you have the good guys. You have Emile, and you have Bomston and Saint-Preux, and you have like you've got all your good guys and your exemplars, and the Savoyard vicar, he's over here, and he's boy, if anybody's sincere, he is. Right. And then over here in the self-deception and the insincere, but you have your bourgeois hypocrite. You have your, the man of the world, the man of society, the people who kind of say one thing and do another. And so this is kind of what the moral universe, at least on a first glance, this is what it looks like. Right. And then, as with everything in Rousseau, you start to look at it a little more closely, and it gets a little more complicated. And you start to look at some of these exemplars of sincerity, people who do value truth telling. They do value treating people with decency. They do value sort of, honesty and candor. And even more than that, they've got a sort of idealized view of themselves as moral beings. They've got a set of ideals that they're striving toward, right? So with Edward Bomston and Julie, it's Stoicism, right? It's the Stoic ideal of detachment and objectivity, and not being affected by, circumstances or fate. This is his kind of self-styled moral view. This is the ideal to which he aspires and which he like reflectively endorses. It's not just an ideal, it's his ideal. Mm-hmm. And so he's sincere, in all these, in all the proper Rousseauian senses. He's like suspicious of society, he values independence of judgment. So he's he's, if anybody's sincere, he is, but then you look and you realize, well, he's also a serial self-deceiver, right? He's constantly selling himself a particular and pretty self-glorifying interpretation of his own motives for action, right? Mm-hmm. So he goes and he does something and he says, oh, well, it's because I'm a Stoic. I'm just doing what a Stoic would do. And then you look a little closer and you're like, well, no, it has nothing to do with Stoicism. It's you had some desire that you're hiding either from us or you're hiding from yourself. Mm-hmm. And so in some way, one of the things I kind of realized was that sincerity and self-deception are not polar opposites. They're actually, I don't want to say dialectically related, but they are enmeshed with each other in a really complicated kind of a way. They sort of mutually entail each other. Whenever I make a claim to sincerity, whenever I, say, well, I'm this sort of person with this identity, and these are my reasons for action. Mm-hmm. All those claims are contestable, and they all depend on a really high level of self-knowledge, right? Which pretty consistently kind of eludes us. And so I think that's to this point, a lot of my work on sincerity and self-deception has really emphasized not the way in which they're different, but actually the way in which they're related and the way in which they kind of mutually inform and entail each other.
And that is just so, that's just a fascinating thought. And it raises the question of whether whether sincerity is a real thing. In other words, is that, if you can't untangle it from self-deception, is it basically just another mode of projection, right, onto the world of your ego or whatever, rather than truthfulness? Because I associate sincerity with truthfulness, that, yes, you are expressing yourself as you truly are, or, you're trying your best to say exactly what you mean and not to lie to yourself or others. Yeah. But if in the process of doing that, you're literally lying to yourself, which is what you're saying, right? You can't disentangle the two. Yeah. And, it's kind of a myth. It's a myth, is it not, that we can be sincere?
It would, at any rate, sincerity of the kind that is attributed to Rousseau. So this idea of staying true to yourself and being sincere, not just in the sense of being forthright, or candid, but being sincere in the sense of like staying true to some kind of self-ascribed principle of identity, right? Mm-hmm. That I'm gonna stay true to myself no matter what anybody says, or so something like this. Well, this entails a certain sort of an account of like your motivations and your reasons for action, and one of the reasons I think Rousseau's like novelistic stuff, I'm increasingly like drawn in that direction. I think it's valuable, is that again and again, he like points out the difference between the way we understand ourselves and our reasons for doing what we do, and the way that other people understand our motives and our reasons for what we do, right? So the novelistic stuff's really helpful in this regard, and that sometimes other people know more about us than we do, right? And it's not for lack of trying, it's just we're hampered and blinded by our own self-love and our inability to extricate ourselves, from ourself. And Rousseau himself, again, in the Reveries, I think this is a motif in the Reveries. This is really thematic. that he looks back on his life, and he's trying to come to terms with everything, that's all the misfortune that befell him. And he has these kind of, he's searching for new, he's trying to come to terms with this. He's trying to reconcile himself to, his fate. And part of his strategy in this regard, or I guess part of what he realizes, is that he has made a whole series of mistakes himself about why he did what he did, and how he views himself in retrospect is very different from how he viewed himself in the moment. That's certainly the Owl of Minerva and all that.
Sure.
But that's part of why I think he's so interesting, and like continues to reward close reading, is because he is sensitive to the limitations of his own projects. He is an autocritical writer, who, if you're careful, and if you are willing to, sort of take the time and everything, he's going to show you what's problematic with what he is saying. And that's a, if he can be aware of what's wrong with what he's doing, maybe I can be more aware of what's wrong with what I'm doing. Right. So he's an exemplar of a weird kind.
Yeah, like if only we could do that, a lot of problems would be solved, because it seems to me that, like we're living through times when people are taking very like strong political positions. That's really nothing new, but this is the latest iteration of it. And I get the sense a lot of times that those political positions are like chosen identities, basically.
Yeah.
That there's more going on there by far than reason. In fact, reason doesn't always really enter into it very much, but rather it's like, this is who I am, I am this or that, and this is what I stand for, and now I've got my crew that I can be with, and that often comes across when expressed as, I am being completely sincere. This is me.
Yeah.
Stepping back from it, you're seeing like tribes basically develop with their, like a whole recipe or program to use, to express yourself. You're not really doing anything unique or special in this regard, but it feels like it. It feels like you're part of something big. And so this is a type of self-deception for sure.
Yeah.
Or where you think that you're doing something very important, when maybe what you're trying to do is find some belonging, be right. That's a big one. People want to be right.
Everybody likes being right. Yeah.
Assert dominance,
Yeah, exactly. Well, notice I couldn't explain my own view of any, question related to Rousseau without explaining, here's why this guy is wrong. I had to always,
you didn't do that much. I think you beat up on Melzer a bit, but that's it.
I can't help it. I mean, I love his work. His work's really good. I just think that the stuff on Sincerity just goes a little too far.
Well, and I love Taylor's work, but I think maybe he's getting Rousseau a bit wrong here and relies a little bit too much on the history of ideas and not economics. So we're both,
that's right.
We're both guilty of somewhat, like asserting our knowledge over others or whatever. But no, I hear what you're saying. Is this is like a very useful way of looking at Rousseau and learning from Rousseau. If he contributes nothing but the ability to sort of examine ourselves a little bit better and more objectively, and maybe head off some mistakes.
Yeah.
That would be extremely valuable. I, for one, can say, I have made many mistakes in my life. And looking back over them, I now realize, boy, I wasted some time there, or I was on idle for what was that?
Yeah.
A whole decade went by, in the pursuit of something that was wrong-headed. and I'm
Mhm.
probably still doing that. That's the thing. But now I'm starting to be realize that I probably am still doing that. And
Mhm.
it would
Mhm.
be nice if I could have gotten to that point about 30 years ago.
Sure.
So maybe like reading Rousseau studiously might help a, a few people do that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Rousseau scholars are any more or less self-deceived than anybody else, right? I don't, I see the same behavior from them that I do from everybody else, and I include myself in that, right?
Yeah. But
But
at least know it. At least you
at least I know it. Yeah, it's something. That's something.